You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio joining you. It is the 6th of June of 2024, and back again to talk some more college sports, as that is a topic that does not obey seasons, does not obey the football season or the basketball season or the baseball season. It's just around all the time, and it's great, man, because they just keep giving us stuff to talk about, you know?
Yeah, Galen, I wasn't in college that long ago, and I feel like you and I would talk about when I was like, yeah, I want to get into college sports. It's great. You'll have the summer to hang out. It's a little chiller, right? And, that's all gone to hell pretty quickly. So, it's pretty crazy right now.
Yeah, and much like it's funny, like we always, I would be a little critical of the NFL or the NBA because it's like there's really no off season with either of these sports. Like, it's just constant conversation, and college sports decided that's what we need. We need to just be in the news all the time. Although I think the difference is the NBA and the NFL do that on purpose. Nobody's steering the ship with college sports. It's just like this isolated colony that's floating through space where nobody's really directing it, but it just happens to be in orbit around everything.
Right. Instead, we're talking about like the draft or free agency. We're just getting people sued left and right. So it's like lawsuits and all that fun stuff. So it's certainly changed a little bit. It
truly is, in some ways, the representation of what American culture is. It's billable hours. That's the best way to describe it all. So
billable hours are always undefeated.
Always. Not only undefeated, but like forming their own super league at this point. So anyway, this is Ben Portnoy. Joining us from Sports Business Journal. We've had Ben on before, IU alum, but also expert on the college sports landscape, especially when it comes to the sorts of things that we're going to be talking about. This is our third podcast out of this series where we're looking at the House versus NCAA case, looking at some of the implications in terms of what exactly is going to happen with college sports as we move forward. And there's just a ton of things that we can talk about on this, and we will. But first, before we get to that, just a reminder, folks, we're brought to you by Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. If you have not yet signed up for the box that could be coming to your door, coming here soon, with the summer series, I'm not sure exactly what you're doing, but you probably need to get on that. Home Field Apparel back with new and exciting stuff. And the Sweet Summer 7 subscription box available still. There's a couple of spots left. If you would like to get first dibs on some UC Santa Cruz gear or some Albion gear, there's a bunch of different awesome schools that are coming in through that. So be sure to head over to homefieldapparel.com, check them out, sign up. Even if you don't sign up for the subscription box, you can still save 15% off your first order. It's HOME23. HOME23 is the code. And you can get yourself a discount on your first order with Home Field Apparel. So be sure to check them out, download the app, follow them on social media, and you'll have lots of awesome stuff in your closet. And you'll eventually have to buy a second closet, which is what happened to me, Ben.
I'm not too far behind you there.
Yeah. Also, just a reminder, folks, that we are on Substack, crimsoncast.substack.com. Be sure to check us out there, sign up for free, get the podcast delivered right to your inbox, occasionally get a VIP video. If you would like to go for the paid option, help support the podcast financially, we always appreciate it. crimsoncast.substack.com. One final note, I mentioned this on the last show, a reminder that we've got coming up another exciting NIL situation going on with IU Volleyball, the IU Volleyball golf outing, taking place at the Hawthorns in Fishers. And you can register for a team or individual registration. It's pretty economical. You will have a great time. You'll get to meet the volleyball team and the volleyball coaching staff. You'll also meet me. I will be there. So head over to inforindiana.com/volleyball. It's a 10 a.m. shotgun start on Thursday, June 27th. I will look forward to seeing you there. Check out the website for more information. Ben, all right. Well, last time we had you on, I think it might have been March, and there was a lot up in the air still regarding what was going to go on with this House case. The settlement really hadn't even been talked about as a thing at that point. And so we've gone from that in 2 months, essentially, to The settlement got voted on. It got approved by all of the conferences. It got approved by the NCAA. So now they're just kind of sorting out the details and getting ready for the judge to rule as to whether or not that settlement is actually legit. I'm assuming, from just to make sure, that the sense is that the judge will indeed bless the settlement. And so that will set up this retroactive set of payments for athletes that were in college sports from 2016 to 2020-ish. And will also set up this cap of $22 million that can be paid directly to athletes moving forward. I guess my question for you is, first of all, like, how surprised are you that we're at the spot we're at right now? And did it go the way that you thought it would overall?
I think it's interesting. Well, I would say two things. I think, for one, you made the point, like, this is still sort of up in the air in the sense of, like, the judge still needs to sign off on it. And that's an important caveat, because if that doesn't happen, then, Lord knows what happens. And that's kind of a separate 3-hour conversation we could have. But for the sake of this conversation, I think we can operate under the assumption the settlement will get signed off. But as far as looking at what this means and why it's important right now, right, I think that fundamentally the biggest piece of this, and it's not necessarily to pat the NCAA on the back, because, like, the reality is they're doing this because they had to. This isn't something that was being done out of the goodness of their heart or the conferences or anyone else, right? Like, that's an important piece. But this is a fundamental shift in the way that college sports operate, right? You are now going from an entity that for 130 years basically has said, hey, paying players is bad, slap you on the wrist if that happens, right? Like, don't even think about giving these guys, $100 to, or paying for a meal, right? To now functionally putting in a system in which schools can share revenue directly with athletes. And I think that that's an important thing to circle, just because it is such a fundamental and huge shift from the NCAA and the conferences. So I would say it's surprising in the sense of it's such a vast change, but I think the reality of it, and that if you look at the landscape of college athletics and the way that they've operated in the last few years with NIL and everything else, like, this kind of was, not to say a means to an end, but, like, it was going to happen eventually, I think is kind of the best way to say it.
It is interesting thinking about where we were in, say, 2015 or 2016, when it felt like, by that point, the arguments about paying players and, this not being an amateur pursuit, we'd finally started to see a couple of things land. You had the whole Kane Coulter Northwestern Union thing with the NLRB that ended up going nowhere. You had the O'Bannon case, which kind of floated over everything, but didn't really feel tangible. So to go from that to 5 years later, basically, the NCAA getting essentially commanded by the Supreme Court saying what you're doing is not legal and you are open to big lawsuits if you keep pursuing things this way. They didn't quite say that directly, but that was essentially the take-home point from Kavanaugh's opinion, to where we're at now. I mean, this has just been a rapid retreat from these supposedly, like, unshakable principles of amateurism and the way that the business model of college sports operates. And it almost feels like it's happened too quickly for any of the ideas to actually be good. Because what you've got, like, not only do you have this rush, but you also clearly, and we'll get to this in a second, you still have a group of people that run college sports that are fundamentally opposed to what the settlement that they just signed on to actually says that they have to do. And that feels like almost irreconcilable. As you said, they had to do it. It is a fundamental shift. I guess they deserve some small credit for doing it, but it also just kind of feels like it's essentially like a shotgun wedding for the NCAA with commercialism, and at least that type of commercialism. And I just don't feel like they're ready for it at this stage.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that's really interesting here. And, like, the people that I talk to in administration and things like that, and conference commissioner offices and things like that, like, I think that's the problem here, is that it's still kind of a waiting game, and that you're talking about, and I guess for the sake of the conversation, like, it's probably helpful to spell some of this out, right? The House case, you've got a couple of pieces to this. There's the cap, you mentioned it. There's the back pay, and then the forward thinking part of this, sort of the third prong of this, is that there's going to be some incentivization to bring NIL stuff in-house and some other things on that realm. Now, again, those are kind of the three pillars we're talking about here. But when you talk about those three pillars, you're still waiting on this lawsuit to be signed, or excuse me, the settlement to be signed off on, and the details can change. And I think that, to get to my original point, like administrators I talk to, like they're running models and they're trying to figure this out. But the reality is the numbers might change tomorrow, let alone like 3 months from now, 4 months from now, 5 months from now, and what they want to do. So I think that you've got a lot of people operating with these like estimates and ideas on how to do it, but the reality is like you don't know how you're actually going to come up with this money. And I think that, to be clear, like if we're going to say, hey, you're going to be able to share revenue up to $22 million, or we can call it $20 million for the sake of using a round number. Schools don't have that just lying around. I think that that's the important piece to this. Like college athletics for years has basically operated under the assumption of like, hey, if we make $100 million, cool, we're going to spend $100 million. Like they're not designed to make money basically. And so all the money that's in these budgets is accounted for, whether that's at Indiana, whether it's at Georgia, whether it's wherever. Like that's just kind of how athletic departments have operated. Like they operate either, right at even, or like maybe a little bit in the green or a little bit in the black, like it's in the red, a little bit in the black. And I think like because of that, like trying to figure out where this money comes from creates this process of like, all right, what do we do?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it does require, and this is a little bit what I was alluding to in my question, like it requires such a fundamental shift of mentality from a nonprofit model with an asterisk next to it, in as much as like a nonprofit model where you're actually making plenty of what you would classify as profit, but you're spending everything to avoid the appearance of having made profit so that there's no justification for paying athletes. Do I have that right?
Correct. That's pretty much what we've operated on.
Yeah. So what this has led to is there's this concept that's gotten brought up by like Andy Schwartz from San Francisco and a few other people, this idea of gold plating in college athletics. So like, for instance, for IU fans who are watching this, walk around campus and walk around the athletics complex and think about like the Big Ten Network launches in 2007. Think about all the athletics facilities that have been built since then. And it's, you've got 2 football expansions. Technically, one of them, I think, happened before that. You've got a new field hockey facility. You've got a new baseball facility, a new softball facility, a new marching band facility, a new volleyball and wrestling facility. You've got a renovation of the soccer stadium. I mean, all of these things have happened. You've also, not just here, but elsewhere, you've had this huge expansion in coach salaries, not just head coaches, many of whom are making significant amounts of money, but assistant coaches, strength and conditioning coaches, in some cases making, close to $1 million a year or more. You've got coaches at non-revenue sports making significant amounts of money. Well, where was all that money coming from? And this is always kind of the piece that gets missed. And even staffing in athletic departments writ large, you've got immense compliance offices, which didn't exist 15 years ago. Why? Well, it's so that we can, again, like that's our business. Our business is compliance with the rules. Of course it is. So now to have to shift, as you said, to a model where you don't have that money lying around, you've already committed that money. The idea that you're going to have $22 million of extra money that's going to just be lying around for you to now pay athletes, you now have to basically shift the entire mentality of how you're doing things. And this is where, people express concern about the college athletics landscape shifting irrevocably. It's like, well, that's already happened. A lot of it was a lack of preparation, but whatever the reason for it, it's ultimately that $22 million is going to have to come from somewhere if you want to stay competitive in the sports that matter from a marketing and alumni relations perspective.
No, you said it. And I think that last point you made is a really good one of like, to be clear, like you don't have to spend $20 million, right? Like this is like a salary cap in football, right? Like let's say you have $100 million to spend. No one's telling you have to spend $100 million. Schools can spend $5 or $10 million, but like for competitive sake, like competition's sake, like schools in the Big Ten, the SEC, wherever, like they're basically going to have to spend up to that cap. And so to your point, like, where does that money come from? I think there's a couple of different things. And I think that one, it's staffing. Are you going to see cuts to athletic department staffs? Texas A&M is a good example, right? They just had a new AD come in, Trev Alberts from Nebraska, and he cut more than a dozen staff. And, my understanding is that's going to save the department about $2.5 million annually. And, that's some of it. Part of this settlement framework is that scholarships. So like if the average scholarship at a school is worth, I'm using a round number, like $50,000, you can count X number of those up to basically $2.5 million toward your cap. Same thing with Alston money that comes through grants and things like that for athletes. So, if you say that, okay, that's like $7.5 million basically between senior staff and Alston money and scholarships. If we're doing just quick math here, you still got to figure out a way to find $13 million. Like, again, this is not like shaking the couch cushions and find it somewhere. And I think, there's a couple of things. Like, I mean, look, like privately, like a lot of administrators I've talked to have expressed concern about having to cut sports. But then the problem is, as with a lot of these things, when you pull one string, you're pulling 7 strings. Like, let's say you cut a sport, right? Like, let's say you cut the men's golf team tomorrow, right? And let's say you're operating on like a $1 million budget, give or take, per year on the men's golf team. Well, if you cut that team, you still got to pay out the coaches over whatever the life of their contracts are. You still got to honor the scholarships of those students if they want to stick around and say, still go to IU or whatever it might be, whatever school it might be. Like, the actual return you see, and you're probably going to get sued over it because that's what happens every time a sports.
It happened at Stanford. I mean, Stanford just tried to cut a bunch of sports during COVID and they got sued.
Right. And so, like, again, like if you cut sports, like you're not going to see the returns on cutting that sport for like 4, 5, 6 years at least, probably. So like, it's not really a magic fix. Yeah. And again, it's just sort of this thing of like, you got to find a way to make the money work. And I think that there's a couple of things. Like, I think Ole Miss mentioned it. Ole Miss AD Keith Carter said something about it the other day that they're pausing a renovation project on their baseball stadium. Like, right. Like facility stuff, I think will take a slight backtrack. Are there sports that, you're going to cut staff? Like, the example that's been given to me a couple of times is like, do we really need a strength and conditioning coach for every single program, or can we operate with 6? Right.
Well, this again, this goes.
I think that's part of it. Like
this goes back to the gold plating thing, because it's like all this money on facilities, all this money on extra coaches, and it's like, that you'll get athletes from other countries that will come to the United States. And they'll be like, they'll go to Northwestern's campus as an example. It's like, wow, these are state-of-the-art facilities. These are as good as anything in any part of our country. And you've got 70 versions of that around the country, if not more. It's wild, the amount of spend. And now, and as you said, like now it's like, well, the ability to pay for those things is gone, but it's not like not doing those things now is generating extra money because you've already spent the money.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think like to that point, like, it's funny. I was talking to a Power 5 AD the other day or a couple of weeks ago about this same thing. And it was about, and they said, they were like, we as an entity basically decided that we need to have, 25 sports and all of them need to have world-class facilities. And we decided this, 15, 20 years ago, basically, as this facilities race got so crazy. Why now am I now beholden for my rowing team to have a world-class facility, or my volleyball team, or whatever it is, right? Like insert Olympic sport here. Yeah. Why can't I basically just say, hey, the programs that make me money, football and men's basketball generally, they're going to have whatever they need, and the rest of the stuff, we're going to make it work. Like, it's going to be nice. We're not going to like gut those facilities or anything like that. But like, are we going to spend the money on these crazy facilities and locker rooms and things like that for Olympic sports? The answer is probably not. And I think I think ultimately, like long-term, is what changes here. Like, I think that the Olympic sports, and particularly, I think men's Olympic sports, are the ones that will suffer because of Title IX concerns, largely. Like, that's not exactly it, but it's to some of that.
Which brings up a side point, which we'll quickly dive into before I get back to the main thrust of things, which is, this is a real problem for the United States of America in terms of Olympic participation and training. Because unlike the academy systems that you see in many competitive countries with a lot of money, the U.S. has, in many areas, decided that they're going to focus all of their Olympic training and prep through the college system. And that if that goes away, or if you've got, a third of the schools participating in those sports, I think they're going to need subsidies if they're going to keep up training at the level that allows the U.S. to be as uber competitive in sports as they always have historically been. But B, that's still a big capital expense that you are providing. And unless you are like in swimming and diving, for instance, if you're in Indiana, or if you're a Texas or a Stanford, you can make the argument like, well, we get a lot of benefits from this. I don't know if you make that same argument as Michigan or, as another school where it's like, well, does it really matter? Does it move the needle? What is it that we're doing this for?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's the thing. Like, the question I keep asking people is like, and I haven't really gotten a clear answer because I don't think anyone really wants to think about it, but like, are we going to get to a world where like the D1 minimum for sports is 8? Or instead of having a minimum sports number constitute D1, is it going to be some other thing like what Charlie Baker proposed from the NCAA earlier this year? Is there some kind of like financial model that sort of creates a delineation between high major college athletics and the rest? Like, maybe that's how you do it as opposed to like the number of sports you're sponsoring. But I think, like, to me, like, I look at this and I look at the realities coming for college athletics of, revenue sharing, of, probably at some point there's going to be collective bargaining because the employment status thing still hasn't been, and that's another discussion we can get into in a second. But like, whether athletes are employees or not is not addressed in this settlement. And that will come next. And I've, spent a long time writing about this for a couple of months and why that's coming next. But those things are probably coming down the pike. And I think that, again, like, yeah, you're going to have to find a way to find $20 million right now or for the next couple of years, or at least till the new TV contracts kick in the Big Ten and the SEC and elsewhere. But at some point, like, you're probably going to have collective bargaining where you have to, even if it's not a 50-50 split, like, let's say it's a 40-60 split, like, that's still another, whatever it is, $20 million or some random number that comes off the books for an athletic department that goes towards athletes and things like that. So I think that because of all those things, like, I think college athletics, this is not a one-time thing, right? Like, there's going to be bigger bills coming, and this is just the first of what will probably be some big bills.
And you've segued right into what I was going to talk about with you next. So there was an article, there's been several articles on this. You've written it. There was one that popped up today in a competitor publication, which I won't mention here on the podcast. But, it talks about, one of the big elements of this settlement has been this idea that the NCAA and its conference members really seem to think they're going to be able to leverage the House settlement into an antitrust exemption that codifies amateurism, and that they're going to get cooperation from the plaintiffs, that they're going to be able to go to Congress, and Congress is going to be like, yes, we need to save the business model of college sports by basically saying that these are not employees. There's two big issues here in my eyes. I'm sure you've got other issues that you would bring up, but one of them is, so you got this $22 million that you're going to be paying at in some cases it won't be a ceiling, it'll be a floor, especially for, like you said, teams in the Big Ten, teams in the SEC, teams that want to remain competitive. You're paying them, but allegedly you're not paying them for being athletes. You're paying them for NIL, which they're not earning that money if they're not athletes, which that seems like a legal argument you could drive a truck through. Basically, it's like you're just paying them because of their market value. You're also claiming you're going to police free market or fair market value, which seems impossible. And so now you've created a scenario where we're paying these people, but they're not employees, but we're paying them ourselves. So what are they at that point if they're not employees? That just seems like even if there is an argument for some kind of an antitrust exemption, like, what is the real argument for them not being employees at this point, other than the NCAA and its schools saying we don't think that they should be?
Yeah, so I think that you're right. All of what you said is right. Like, this is still college athletics leaders basically, in so many words and in sort of layman's terms, say, hey, we're doing this settlement. We're working to try and figure this thing out. Congress, help us and give us an antitrust exemption that basically lets us not qualify athletes as employees. Now, what does that mean? Like, this is all really complicated, and I get we're in the weeds. So, like, to dumb it down and to really simplify it for people, I think, like, think about it this way. If you're an employee, you get things like overtime, workers' comp, all of those things, health insurance, right? Like, things like that. If schools now have to pay that through to all their athletes, that's a lot of money that they're having to pay on top of whatever it is they're spending on facilities, whatever revenue they're sharing with athletes through revenue share, through broadcast rights and things like that. So that's why I think employment status is a big deal. It basically adds, again, kind of what I alluded to earlier, like another huge check on top of what they're already paying. College athletics, again, has basically said, hey, if we go to Congress and say, hey, we're trying to fix this, give us help. And by help, I say an antitrust exemption, which basically means, hey, college sports, go do what you're doing. We'll let you do what you're doing, and we'll make some kind of law, bill, whatever it is, that says college athletes are not employees for under these terms, and make it hyper specific. That's possible. Like, that's happened, not quite to that degree, but like antitrust exemptions have been granted as far as like in pro football, pro baseball, things like that. Like this happens in professional sports and has happened in professional sports, but it's very different for the college level because you're talking about students at the school.
Right.
And it's a little bit different. But I think that like to actually answer your question, like this is again, like if you're talking about adding another huge bill on top of what you're already going to have to pay in the House settlement, not to mention the back damages that are going to be paid out over 10 years, I have a hard time. I just have a hard time believing that people on Capitol Hill are going to be moved by this, but maybe they will. And I think, again, it's important to know, like in an election year, like there's a lot of other issues that Congress is dealing with, and this is not toward the top of the list. And I think that, there's been close to a dozen, if not more, hearings on Capitol Hill about NIL and college athletics and a handful of bills and all of those things. And it's gone nowhere. I mean, it hasn't even been heard on, I don't think the Senate's heard any of them. I think maybe a few have been heard on the House floor, give or take. But again, this hasn't really progressed anywhere. And so I think that if your Hail Mary is to say, is that Congress is going to be the thing that fixes it, I have a lot of doubts.
So we had a question from longtime friend of the pod, Mike Petrie, which kind of ties into this. What's the best explanation for the NCAA's commitment to what seems like an obviously losing strategy? Are they fighting a war of posts, hoping the athletes wear themselves out? Are they addicted to losing? Are they looking to milk a losing position as long as they can? Do they actually believe that they're going to get an antitrust exemption? Like, it does seem self-defeating because, as you just said, like, there seems to be no traction for this. There's not really a legal argument. You mentioned like pro sports, but when you've gone out of your way to say we're not pro sports and we actually want these people to remain amateurs, which is not codified anywhere in law, it does feel weird that rather than looking at the landscape and saying, how can we make this work the best moving forward, given the bills that you so aptly point out are coming due soon, it just feels odd that this is still the hill that the NCAA and its member institutions seem to want to die on.
Yeah, and like, I will say this, for the NCAA side of things and college sports' side of things, right? Like, college athletics are fundamentally different than pro sports, like at least outside of football and men's basketball, really. Right? Like the men's golf team and the volleyball team, right? Like those are very different things than we're talking about with like football and men's basketball and, women's basketball some places. Like, that's fine. But I think that what you run into here with the NCAA is that, like, if you're going to collectively bargain, or if those are things that have to happen, like under federal law, for you to collectively bargain, you have to be constituted as an employee. So like basically what college athletics is saying is, hey, let us collectively bargain, but don't classify anyone as the thing that allows them to collectively bargain. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And it's this sort of like catch-22 that doesn't really quite get there. And I think that, like, I do get it. I think that there is something to the fact that like college athletes are different than professional athletes in that, right? Like, they're going to class, they're getting a degree, they're enrolled in the university, things like that. Like, there are pieces to this that I understand, but I do think that, like, if you are going to go down that road of employment or try to thread this needle where they're pseudo employees but not really employees, and you're going to try and get a collective bargaining agreement in place, like, that's really complicated. And it requires a players union and things like that. And that's another conversation that we can have. But like, college sports are so disjointed that I think that to get some level of that, I think would be really difficult. And I think, like, to bring it back, like, I think that's why the NCAA is going with the realm, sort of the avenue that they are, is that, like, let's take just college football, for example, right? You've got 135 or give or take 139, I think, FBS teams right now. Like, 120 kids each team, that's a lot of players, right? You're basically saying, let's take that number of 18 to 22-year-olds and get them to all agree on a bunch of stuff. Like, that's a different thing than having a bunch of 10-year NFL veterans putting together something for the players union and things like that, right? Like, and that's not to discount like 18 to 22-year-olds. Like, look, like I'm not that far removed from it myself, not to be hypocritical. Like, but like, I do think that because of how the disjointed nature of college sports and the people who are participating in it, fundamentally, like there are reasons why you wouldn't want them to be employees. But I think, again, like it's still threading a really, really, really narrow needle. And I think I have a hard time believing that this is going to change anything or sway people.
I will say the one thing, because I've heard that argument before and I mostly agree with it, but I will say this, the vast majority of NFL players are 5 years or less in the league.
Mm-hmm.
The number of 10-year veterans or even 8-year veterans is actually really small in that league. And, the average career length, I think in the NFL is only like 3 years. So, I always think it's interesting when that's brought up, this idea that, well, college athletes aren't in long enough, to really make a difference or to know enough about the rules. And yet that's essentially how professional sports union membership works as well. It's not like they've all been there for 30 years and, been voting for that long. So, but the larger point I think is well taken. And it just feels like there's not really a clear alternative that everybody can agree to that would say, all right, we recognize this issue that, okay, we've got to pay these people for playing, even if we don't want to say it. But that's where I do, for as much as people complain about the reorganization of college athletics, it's just right now not built on a foundation that's sustainable if you have to pay the players. And that, like, we can dance around that issue all we want, but you can't have the whole bouquet of college sports as we know them run the way that they're run with all of the money or most of the money coming from a couple of sports. Take those sports, cordon them off and still have the same system that you've had before. So it's like one way or another, it feels like there has to be some kind of fundamental shift. I just don't know what that looks like, but clearly that's not something that the leaders in college sports seem to quite grasp either, which is interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing to me that I thought was so interesting when Charlie Baker's proposal came up earlier this year, or I guess late last year, in that when the NCAA basically said, hey, we want to create this division basically of schools that can pay up to an amount that allows them to basically directly share in revenues with athletes, functionally what we're going to see with the House settlement, like a sort of precursor to it. But pieces of that were very much like, hey, it can't be used toward recruiting. It can't be used toward some other things. And it was sort of this pseudo model of like, yeah, it takes like a couple of steps forward, but it also takes a couple of half steps back because it's still clinging on to fundamentally this idea of amateurism, which I just don't think is real. And I think that that's the problem, is that you've got this. So that's the hypocrisy of this whole thing a little bit, of like, you want to say kind of what you said, you want to have your cake and eat it too. Like, this isn't something where you can't pay athletes these large sums of money and still say, hey, this isn't professional. Like, that's just not how this works. Like, can 7th and 8th graders playing soccer do this and just not be paid? Yeah, I think that's fine. But like, is college athletics, especially football and men's basketball, like when you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars per player and millions of dollars overall, billions of dollars overall, like it's just, the NCAA, I think, keeps grasping for this pseudo model that keeps some of the things in place that previously existed, while also sort of being like, oh, okay, but we'll like pick and choose some of these little things that we have to do now because of the realities that we live in. And I think that to me seems foolhardy, because I don't think it's realistic. And I think it's holding on to too much of the past model that just isn't feasible moving forward.
One of the topics that's popped up here lately that's been interesting has been this idea of potential roster limits or the elimination of walk-ons. Matt Rule went nuts on that a couple of weeks ago. We've heard some other people commenting like it would destroy the soul of college athletics. It got me thinking, though, about different models that might be utilized. Because, I mean, there pretty much every FBS program, at least in the Power 2, They've got tons of walk-ons. They make a big deal about, oh, this guy earned a scholarship this time around. It's been kind of a staple of college sports. And you go back to like overstocking of rosters at the college level has been a pretty consistent thing. My favorite is always that picture of the Pitt team that won the national title, where they've got like 140 people in the picture, and it's like, really, and they've gradually had to put scholarships limits in. I was thinking though, there's no way, I think we could kind of agree in this new landscape that the lower tier FBS schools are going to be able to compete, like the Ball States, the teams that are in the group of 5 conferences. Like, it's just, maybe with an occasional exception, it just doesn't look like it's financially feasible. You've also got all these FCS programs who might even be in bigger trouble in terms of like, well, are there, whatever money they're making, are they having to give some of that? The money goes a lot less far at that level than it does at the FBS level. Is this the time for some of these schools on a regional basis to start thinking about using FBS and FCS schools that aren't in the big mix as essentially farm teams, as developmental level leagues where, okay, Michigan, you go out and you recruit all the players that you want, knowing you're not going to play all of them. Can you put some of your freshmen on Western Michigan or Eastern Michigan's team and have them play there for a couple of years and then bring them up? Some of this requires them signing employment contracts, obviously, but one of the things everybody hates is the transfer portal and this idea that, well, they're not employees, so we can't stop them from transferring legally. That's been like, with the NCAA just had to announce that they can't restrict transfers. I mean, they just did that, a couple of weeks ago. But if you did have that mode where it's like, all right, you're signing with Michigan, we've got you for at least 3 years, but we want to go send you somewhere where you can actually play rather than just sit on the bench and wait. Does that provide additional opportunities for the lower level teams and also provide something for the Power 5 or Power 2 team where it becomes a little more communal? It takes some of the risk off of both. I don't know. It's been something I've been musing about because it feels like it would work in both football and in basketball.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good idea, but I think like functionally that's what's happening right now, right? Like, I think
right.
That's functionally what's going on is that, the best players in the group of 5 are all, transferring or leaving. I forget. I think it was The Athletic who did a story a couple months ago now about I think like of the 24 all conference players in CUSA 2 years ago, maybe like 19 of them transferred to high major schools after the season. Like, this is kind of already happening. And I think that that's the reality, like whether it's actually codified or not, I don't know that would happen just because I think of the logistical hurdles of it. But I do think like it's realistic. Like, I think it's a fair point. Like, what is the role of these group of 5 schools moving forward? Because I think that, a lot of those schools, like when you talk to athletic directors in that area, that sort of realm, like, most of those schools operate with budgets of less than $50 million, and they're getting huge amounts of money in student fees from the school and things like that, and help from the university. So like to say, hey, insert school here that's spending $50 million a year on athletics, we now need you to spend $20 million of that on your football team. Like, it's just not realistic. Like, they can't do it. And so I think that, it will change the way that those schools operate. But for now, at least with the new CFP deal, through, I guess, 6-year extension that goes into effect, I believe it's 2032 or 2028. I have my dates mixed up here. But for the 6-year extension that kicks in, the group of 5 will have a seat at the table for the college football playoff. But whether that remains the case, we'll see.
What do you think regarding this argument that the House settlement actually helps stave off the NCAA tournament potentially being subverted by the power conferences? And this idea that because obviously the 27 conferences that are not in the Power 5 and are on the hook for a certain percentage of the payouts on this on the back pay for athletes, like now there's a vested interest in the power conferences keeping those conferences and the tournament afloat. I mean, do you see that as, maybe for some fans like a positive offshoot of what's happened so far with this case?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I think that there was a lot of discussion about expanding the NCAA tournament this year. And that's been a hot button topic in the background for a couple of years. But I think there's, first of all, not a ton of appetite for it. I think that when you're Greg Sankey in the SEC and you have a really rough start to the tournament and, he's the one saying, hey, we need more teams for our great league, you kind of get your foot stuck in your mouth a little bit when that happens. And I think that's probably, for lack of a better term, probably a little poetic justice for a lot of people. But I do think that it is – I do think the House case will help keep things together, at least for the time being. I think the confluence of two things. I think the House case is one. I think that the latest round of media deals that the Big Ten, the SEC, Big 12, and the ACC obviously goes on for a while, but we'll see what happens with Clemson and Florida State. That's a whole other thing.
That's a podcast for later in the summer. We're going to save that one. Yes.
Yeah, we'll save that one for July. So, mark your calendars now. But I do think that with those media deals, with the college football playoff media deal in place, with the House settlement, it does allow for at least like a momentary breath of stability, or at least that like things won't be uprooted right now. But I think that's been the reality, though, is when you look at this and you look at the history of when conference realignment has changed things and stuff has happened in this realm, it's come around the times that media deals are up. And I think that the Mountain West has a media deal that's up in 2025 and they're working through things right now. But like none of the Power 5 conferences have media deals that are up for at least another couple of years. So I think at that point, like that's when you might see the next round of, major changes. But for now, like assuming the settlement goes through, which is which is an assumption for sure. But if that's the case, then I think it does give you a little bit of leeway for a little bit of time, at least for the next couple of years.
Going to be a lot to keep track of, including that Clemson's Florida State ACC thing, which God knows where that heads. There was just the ACC just appealed an appeal today, and I think what those teams have to make a decision on what they want to do by early August. So lots of keep an eye on there, and obviously we don't know exactly when the House settlement will be fully decided upon, but it'll be sometime this summer. So we'll keep an eye on things, and Ben, obviously in Sports Business Journal and on X. A guy you want to follow if you want to keep track of what's going on with all this. Ben, as always, a pleasure talking with you, and I wish you the best of luck trying to keep track of all this stuff.
No, I appreciate it. It's been fun. I'm not sure if I can earn a law degree in 3 weeks, but I feel like I'm pretty close these days. So just claim you're an amateur lawyer. It's fine. It seems to work for the NCAA. It's I don't know. No, you're law. That's nuts, man. The whole thing. It's like, who knew that we would have to learn this much about contract law following sports? It's crazy. It's crazy. But no, I appreciate you having me. Always fun.
Thanks to Ben Portnoy from Sports Business Journal for joining us. Thanks to all you folks for listening in. We'll catch you folks later on. We'll have more podcast content coming up. For everybody, I'm Galen Clavia. This is Crimson Cast. Bring back the Bison. Catch you folks on the flip side. So long, everybody.